welcome to Overtime Hockey Talk. My name is Mark Paul. My co-host Justin Baker and I are on a mission today to determine what team has the longest rebuild all the way into what team has the longest Stanley Cup window and everything in between. We're going to go through all 31 teams. Justin has a list, 31 up to 1, and then I'm just going to pick his list apart.
Pick his list apart.
I have everything in terms of the numbers and how long teams go. I just didn't rank them. Justin went the extra mile and ranked them. So we're going to use his list and then we're going to have some fun. So tell me, Justin, your the way you determine the list. I like the way you kind of thought through it.
Yeah.
Let's just go through that before we get started.
This was a tough list because you have a lot of teams where like their window is tiny or where they might be a bubble team, right? But they absolutely have no shot at winning a Stanley Cup. I mean, ideally, if you really look at it. So what I did is I took teams that maybe have, a window there to make the playoffs, but if they're only a couple years till their team basically has to do a rebuild, you fell lower on the list, right? But maybe you're a team that is a contender, whether your window's, smaller or larger, you're going to be a little bit higher up on the list because you are a contender.
Yeah.
Right.
That was, so I broke, the way I did mine, I broke mine up into 3 categories. I did the teams that are the rebuilders, and I determined how long I thought their rebuild would take to get them to the playoffs.
I like that.
And then how long that rebuild would take to get them to become Stanley Cup contenders. And then for the my second category is the playoff contenders. I split it up into East and West because I think the majority of teams fall into that category. Like the majority of teams are not Stanley Cup contenders, but the majority of teams aren't quite rebuilding at this point.
Sure.
And so then I kind of determined whether or not those playoff contenders were trending up and towards becoming a Stanley Cup contender or trending down and going to become rebuilders soon. And then, of course, the Stanley Cup contenders, I did the same as you, kind of determined how long I thought their window might be based on the age of their players and the salary cap constraints and who they might need to sign here in the next few years if that was going to force them to have to move people. So that's where I landed. So you've got the list. Let's go off your list and we'll pick each other apart here.
I love it. Okay. So basically, this is a show where we're going to just rip everything I say apart. I love it. All right. So
he didn't know this coming in, but
didn't know it. Great. Not only did I have to drive through a crap ton of snow this morning, it snowed like a foot and a half, but
your dedication is off the charts. In comparison to mine, I got up and I walked into the other room. So
yeah, must be nice.
Thank you for making the trek. You are the one with the truck.
That's true.
Although I do have an escape. I guess that's
yeah, you can still get through the snow.
It's like half. It's half. It's better than a car.
There you go.
But not a truck.
Yeah. All right. So the 31st team on my list with the longest rebuild to go, in my opinion, is the Ottawa Senators.
Okay, Ottawa Senators.
Yeah. Basically, my thought process behind this, and you can look at other teams at the bottom of the standings. Yes, they got a couple solid defensemen in the system with Thomas Chabot, Brandstrom coming up. But to me, the biggest issue with them is they have no ideal or, identified number one center potential prospects, right? I mean, they've
Brady
got
Tkachuk.
Well, he's not a center.
He's more
right?
of a winger. But
he's a winger. But, I mean, they've got Josh Norris, who could be a really, really good number two-way center eventually, and he has shown some flashes of, offensive upside. But, besides him, and maybe you could throw Logan Brown in that category, although he's not really impressed me much lately. But, besides those two guys, there's not a whole lot coming in the pipeline toward, in terms of centers. And then goaltenders, too. They've got nothing. In my opinion, I don't like anything in terms of their goaltending prospects, and so when you don't have goalies, when you don't have number one centers, to me, you're dead already.
Yeah. Well, the way that I look at it for the Ottawa Senators, I'm thinking, all right, star power is definitely there. Like Brady Tkachuk he's the real deal.
He's going to be their next captain too, for sure.
And then of course Thomas Chabot. Yeah, and he's locked up for $8 million for the
lot
next
of money.
8 years after this season. So yes, a lot of money, but for what you're getting, I think if he's on the open market as a 26-year-old, he's getting 11 million.
Well, yeah, you look at what Carlson just signed for, and you're like, oh, we got Thomas Chabot, who ideally could be that type of player, next year or two.
He's not going to put up the same amount of points that Carlson put up through his tenure there, but he's still
he's going to be a bargain.
Effective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and when I see, to me, I have their window a little bit shorter. That's going to take them. They aren't my longest team, but I'm looking at them and I'm going, okay, they're going to finish bottom of the league again this year, probably bottom of the league again next year. All of these potential rebuilds all change if this team can win the lottery. Like if you win the first overall pick, especially this year, like if you get one of the lottery picks in the top 2 and you get Byfield or Lafreniere, like things are looking much, much different. Like if the Ottawa Senators have Quentin Byfield.
Oh, absolutely. Now you got your number one center. Yeah.
Suddenly things look a little bit different. Now if they, the draft doesn't go their way and they end up picking 6th, you're still going to get a nice player. It may not be as quick of a turnaround. I see this team as a team that could maybe, since you've got Shabbat, you can build around him, and you have Brady Tkachuk, you're going to build around him. And there's some guys that are having some good years, like Anthony Duclair, and I don't mind Colin Wilson as a top 6 forward. Don't necessarily love him as a top guy, but as a top 6 forward, he's fine. I think this is a team that could be back in the playoffs in 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
And from there, you're looking at, let's say Ottawa gets 2 top 5 picks over the next 2 years. That third year, I don't think that it's out of the realm of possibility to go, they'll probably have their number 1 center, and they'll probably have something else, whether that be a top 4 defenseman or another top 6 forward. And suddenly they're looking pretty good, probably because they're going to, after this year, they're going to shed as many people as they want to shed. And then it's a matter of if their owner is willing to dole out some money.
Yeah, and that's the other big issue too, right? Management's always been a huge issue for me, and that is something I took into effect with a lot of these rankings. Ottawa, obviously they've been known as they're going to be at the bottom of the cap basically for the next few years, I think. And so if you're management, right, and you're rebuilding, you're not willing to go out and spend the money. For instance, like the New York Rangers, right? They went out and they spent the money on Panarin, knowing that they're in rebuild mode, but that's going to help drive and help escalate that rebuild a little bit quicker, in my opinion. And so you won't have that if you're the Ottawa Senators, for sure.
Yeah, and I don't think that anybody in their goaltending pool is necessarily a sure bet,
right?
Either. And with Craig Anderson, they've been playing Hogberg a lot. I think he started his 3rd or 4th game in a row over Anderson. So Anderson, he'll be done after this year. I think he probably will retire. Maybe he goes and he backs up somewhere, but at 38 years old, probably
not a lot of suitors.
Right.
Yeah.
So their goaltending situation does worry me. That's where you're probably going to have to sign a free agent, or if Hogberg can somehow turn out. It's hard to tell how good a guy is when their team is so mediocre in front of them.
Right. Anders Nielsen has shown flashes of being a decent goaltender, but again,
he's always shown flashes of being a halfway reasonable goaltender. Yeah. And that's really what he is. He's a halfway decent goaltender who will play on bad teams that need to fill a hole. Yeah, he's a hole filler.
A hole filler.
Okay, so all right. I don't disagree, though, that Ottawa is definitely towards the bottom of those rebuilds. Let's go with your number 30.
Number 30 for me is the Anaheim Ducks. Might be a shocker for some people, but
okay, I like it.
Yeah, this is a team that's competed pretty well over the last few seasons, but you slowly see them starting to dissolve, right? They've got a lot of older guys signed up for a few years. Adam Henrique, Jakob Silfverberg, who to me is almost, I don't want to say a bust, but he just hasn't panned out to what you think that guy could have been, right? He's turned more into a two-way guy, maybe a second-line winger who can really play some good defensive minutes, but he's not that scorer that you need. And for a team that is second worst in the league at scoring behind the Detroit Red Wings, you need some scores, right? Getzlaf's not getting any younger. They, bought out Corey Perry. They really don't have, they've got Max Jones, Sam Steele coming up, but Max Jones hasn't really impressed me this year at all. Sam Steele, I'm not too sure about him yet. Maybe those two guys might take a few years to season. Maybe they might come around, but
What kind of seasoning are you using in those guys?
Monterey steak seasoning. So
okay,
yeah.
all right. So they'll be okay then. Not great, but they'll be okay.
They'll be okay. The one shining, thing about the Ducks, though, outside of, that they have an aging core and, group of forwards that just don't impress me, like Shania Twain would say, is John Gibson. I mean, to me, he's a top 3 goalie in this league. And they've got him locked up for a lot of years at a really, really nice cap hit.
Yeah, nice cap hit.
And they've got some decent pieces on defense, but unless they turn the rebuild around quick, these Hampus Lindholm, Cam Fowler, those guys are going to be a little bit older, and you don't know what you're going to get out of those guys, when they're in their 30s at that point by the time you restock the cupboards up front.
Right. And, to me, though, I think that Anaheim is I can see Anaheim in even next year, Anaheim could make the playoffs to me. Which I still think, I agree, they're in a rebuild. And I don't necessarily think they're competing. They're not trying to, it's almost, they're one of the bubbles. They're kind of between that playoff and rebuild because they haven't really committed to a rebuild.
Right. Although I think it was the owner or GM, I can't remember who it was, just came out the other day and said, we're willing to take on cap, right? They want people to dump their...
Yep. And in exchange for a first round pick or something or a second round pick. So
at this point, they're at that borderline where they're okay, we probably should start doing rebuild at this point.
Well, and they know that at least for this year and probably next, they're not doing anything.
Sure.
And that's now the real signature of all right, we're going to rebuild here is, can you convince Ryan Getzlaf, if we can move you now, we can actually get something, and let's all move on together. It's not that he's not a good player anymore or a guy that you'd want around, but it's just useless to have him there.
Sure.
He can go and be a fantastic second line center for a team. He can kind of reignite his career. He's just kind of rotting there in Anaheim right now, and it's just
33 points in 46 games is not bad at all.
No, especially when you're not really playing with much. He actually scored 11 goals too, which he's on pace to have his best goal scoring year since 2014-15.
Nice,
but there just isn't much to go around, and I'd agree. But to me, at least coming into this year, they were a team that was still trying to make the playoffs. They didn't do anything to show me otherwise, but especially with the defense core, and maybe their defense core is just overrated at this point. Manson, Lindholm, Fowler, you look at that, and on paper, you at least say that's a pretty darn good start. Any team would take any 3 of those players. I don't think there's a team in the league that wouldn't take one of those 3 guys and add them to their top 4 and be better. Outside of maybe even Nashville would probably be willing to take one of them. So,
yeah, Lindholm could be on the move. He's got a relatively low cap hit for a top 4 defenseman at just $5.2 million. So he would be a good little trade bait to throw out there.
Yeah, but to me, I think Anaheim can do more of they can pull more of a San Jose here. Perhaps maybe they can retool. I think that you can convince someone to come and sign there. They've got the cap space.
And that's the thing. You could just overpay in the offseason for somebody, and then you can ideally bring in a couple guys up front who can help increase that scoring, and then boom, you're right back in the thick of it.
Yeah, next year is the bulk of the Corey Perry cap hit. $6.6 million is next year's cap hit for him. But leading out of that, right now, yes, it says they have $2 million in cap space, but they also have Ryan Kessler, who's on long-term injury, and he'll be there, so they can always get the 6.8 whenever they need it, if they need to go over the cap. And they, Getzlaf is done after next season, so
that's $8 million off the books,
right?
And he's not getting that kind of money again either. So,
yeah, he might get 6.
Yeah, he could get a Kevin Hayes type situation.
Well, he probably would. At that point, at the end of his deal, he's 36 years old. So Getzlaf's probably getting some 1 to 2 year deals. Maybe someone gives him
type money.
Gives him a Marlowe kind of deal.
Okay.
Where he goes somewhere else and he's able to get that 3rd year, which ultimately you saw that 3rd year kind of screwed Marlowe over a little bit. I guess he got paid for it.
Right.
Because Carolina
screw him over too bad.
bought him out, right? Yeah. So I mean, you're not mad about having like a guy like Rickard Rakell. This is just a team that I can see if they make one or two moves, maybe they get lucky and win the draft lottery. Suddenly, I don't want to trade Getzlaf anymore. If I've got someone on his wing now, Lafreniere on his wing, and I can go, hey, you get to play with him for the next 3 or 4 years and close out your career, kind of showing this kid the way. Getzlaf isn't a bad guy to do that,
right? Not too bad.
Consummate pro, at least you've got that. So, I disagree that Anaheim has the second longest rebuild because I do think that they at least have pieces to move. Like Ottawa, long rebuild. They don't really have anybody that they can go, okay, we've got desirable high-end guys who we could trade and actually pull in some good pieces.
Sure.
Anaheim, at least, like, if they were able to move Getzlaf, they'd be able to get a first-round pick plus for Getzlaf. There's not much on Ottawa that I'd go, yep, I'll give you a first-round pick for him, which definitely slows a rebuild. And Anaheim has proven that they're willing to spend their money.
That's true.
And so that accelerates things a little bit. But I feel like Ottawa is really the only team that just is completely unwilling to spend money. So for that reason, it's not a bad idea to have them at the bottom because they'll probably always toil. Okay, who's your number 29?
The oldest team in the league, the Detroit Red Wings.
Are they really the oldest team in the league?
They are the oldest average team in the league. Okay. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I like a lot of the pieces the Detroit Red Wings have. The problem is cool. They've got good guys up front, good young guys who can be leaders, who can be scorers in the future. You know, Mantha, Bertuzzi, Larkin, Zadina, Joe Veleno's coming up because he looked really good with Lafreniere at the World Juniors. So
who doesn't?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that guy looked really good with Sidney Crosby. I know, right? I know. Zach Cassian looked real good playing with McDavid.
Yeah, he's about to get a new deal too. And they've got one or two decent prospects on D. You can still maybe throw in Philip Roenick's name in there. Moritz Snyder, I love that guy.
Moritz Snyder is a nice piece.
But not much else on the D, in terms of prospects, and no future number one goaltenders coming up through the pipeline. That worries me tremendously, especially because, I mean, let's face it, if you don't have goaltending, you don't really have anything in this league. So, and one of the reasons I put them in front of Anaheim is I love Steve Yzerman, right? I mean, not only is he just a homegrown Detroit guy in terms of, did his career here, he's coming back to fix the team he loves, right. But you've seen it in Tampa where he's willing to be aggressive, he's willing to trade, he's willing to spend the money. So he'll do what it takes to get this rebuild going.
And I keep wondering, because Moritz Seider was taken at what, 6?
6, yeah. And
I think that, was Hedman taken at 4 or was he taken at 5?
I think Hedman was 2.
Oh, he was 2. Okay,
number 2, yeah.
I just want, but I think when they took Hedman, did he take him ahead of where he was actually ranked?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or Hedman, yeah, I think Hedman was ranked a little bit like in 3 or 4, maybe somewhere down there. But I mean, regardless, like Moritz Snyder, for example, he was ranked probably like, I think people had a mid first round, maybe even number 20 in terms of potential, but. I mean, still, if you see the prospect there and, again, for a team that's really strapped on defense and doesn't have a lot of prospects, you take a little bit of a reach and hope it works out. And it's looked like it's going to work out so far. But, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, those are the things that you can do as a team that's in last place. You can scoop guys up that have talent but have been knocked around. Like, I keep wondering when Josh Ho-Sang's going to go to the Red Wings.
Right.
But... yeah, the Red Wings, so I have them as they could make the playoffs in 3 years max. Like, I don't see them in the division that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the next 3 years, Boston isn't going anywhere. Tampa's not going anywhere. Toronto's not going anywhere. And Florida's probably like they're looking like they're
going to be okay.
They're gonna do okay. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Montreal is always gonna try.
That's the best way I've ever heard it put.
And the Buffalo Sabres will hopefully one of these days make the playoffs.
Hopefully.
So to me, there's just too many teams ahead of them in what the Red Wings are attempting to do now.
Right.
And so it seems like there's no point in trying to rush it. Now, could they make the playoffs in 2 years and have like a New Jersey Devils kind of like, wow, they blew the socks off it? Like Gerard Gallant is the head coach now, and he had a great first year, and he pushed us, and we finished with the wild card spot, and we lost in 5 games in the first round, and then then the following year we kind of go dip back down and regress a bit. But this team isn't really going to compete for much until they can dump some of this like Darren Helm and Abdelkader and Franzen and Franz Nielsen. Sorry, Franzen doesn't really matter.
They're still paying him, right?
Nice that finally Erickson and Daly, some of these guys that are just dead weight, they're coming off the books. So it'll be interesting to see, though. I mean, even a guy like DeKaiser, like $5 million for a guy who's probably on a cup team is a third pairing defenseman,
right?
So. And you got to re-sign Mantha, though, at the end of this year. So,
yeah, they'll get that deal done. But again, to your point, I mean, yeah, they've got a lot of teams ahead of them, and that's why I have them at towards the bottom in terms of longest rebuild to go, because you've got to stockpile good players and shred some of these contracts so that you can be ready to compete, in 3-4 years to try to jump a few of these teams ahead of you.
Right. They are in a better. The thing is, though, they've been in a rebuild for the last 3 years.
Yeah, and I don't think Kenny Holland was the right guy to do it. He just doesn't know how to.
No.
Never had to.
No.
And so now you're bringing a guy who has shown he can rebuild a team.
Right, from scratch.
Right.
When you're considering, all right, they've already been in a rebuild for 3 years, and now how long until they can make the playoffs? I'm saying another 3 years, and they're like maybe in that third year they make the playoffs. It might be that extra year, but they're going to compete for they're going to move out of rebuild status, even though they'll be still building. They're going to move into the playoff contender position, I think, in 3 seasons. So not next year, not the year after, but the year after that, they will be in a position where I think everyone goes, all right, this team, we've been rebuilding for 5 years now. Now is the time. Like, we should be able to make the playoffs. Whether they make the playoffs or not, I don't know, but they're going to move up into that contender spot for a playoff. And then to me, it's 6 to 7 years before they can become cup contenders.
Okay.
From this point on. So 6 seasons, they might be I think Yzerman, like I would trust that Yzerman can do more than the average.
6 years. Yeah, and I mean at that point too, you've got Larkin who's going to be 28, 29 in 6 years, so
yeah, I'm not necessarily looking at this iteration. Like, it's nice. I mean, that's actually not a bad place to have a guy like Larkin if he's still around in 6 years. But I'm looking at like a Zadina. I'm thinking that the Red Wings are going to get a lottery pick. So, if they end up with Lafreniere or Byfield, that is when those guys are going to be right in their prime.
Just ripe.
In 6 years. Those guys will be ready to go. A long playoff run. They'll be seasoned, and hopefully, like a Moritz Seider, he's going to be probably a top 10 defenseman in the league, seeing as how Yzerman drafts guys.
Right.
So, but yeah, it takes some time to because on top of that, Yzerman's going to build the cupboards back up. Like you saw what he did in Tampa, how he just was able to, like, you looked at them and you said that guy on their fourth line would be in other teams' top sixes. That is, when you're in that position, you can compete for a cup, because then you can deal those pieces and acquire others that you need elsewhere in your lineup. So, I'd say, though, 6 years for the Red Wings to really rebuild their whole cupboards.
All right, wonderful.
All right, 28.
28, moving on. For me, it's the New Jersey Devils.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe some people are looking at me crazy or listening and just saying, this guy's loco, their rebuild window should be a lot shorter now. They should be closer to the playoffs. However, don't get me wrong, Jack Hughes is nice, but
he sure.
Yeah,
nice,
and he sure. They're two great. You have two potential number 1A, 1B type center guys that you can throw out there at any situation, which would be nice. But, outside of that, there's not a ton that impresses me. I mean, PK Subban does not look like anything close to the Norris Trophy defenseman he once was.
Do you think he'll figure it out?
I hope so. And I hope with new coaching, they can turn him back into what, they were hoping he was. But to me, the biggest concern is goaltending. Mackenzie Blackwood is okay, but I don't think he's going to be anything more than a career backup. obviously they're locked down to Corey Schneider for another couple seasons, and honestly, nobody's going to take that contract.
He might just go on LTIR.
Maybe they buy him out, in another year. Who knows with the upcoming CBA, but outside of those two guys, there's nothing in the cupboards for goaltending. I mean, they do have a nice defensive prospect, Ty Smith, who looks like he could be the real deal and could be a potential top four. Sami Vatanen, probably their best defenseman outside of PK Subban.
Free agent at the end of the year.
He's probably going to get moved at the deadline, and he's going to go sign somewhere else.
And probably Andy Green, probably going to get dealt. Deadline here.
He'll be number 7, number 6 defenseman probably on another team.
Yeah, I mean, a third pairing defenseman, Andy Green, not so bad.
No, not at all.
It's just when he's your top 4 defenseman, you're in big trouble.
Right. So, so they've got the 2 centermen, which to me is the most important pieces you need to be a contender, and then goaltending in my mind. But again, outside of that, there's nothing in this system, in this team, that really excites me to say they're closer to being a playoff contender than they are a rebuilder.
Yeah, I am. This is how far I'm willing to go with the New Jersey Devils. So I actually have them in 2 years. They can be playoff contenders. I think with Jack Hughes coming into he hasn't looked great, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. There's a reason he went first overall. Let's assume that he's a okay, like a decent number 1 center. I'm thinking like Ryan Johansson kind of number 1 center is maybe the hope that he.
Yeah, and that's not bad.
No. And then Nico Hischier. We know what Nico Hischier looks like. He's going to be a great two-way center.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is going to complement anyone. And so you're not mad about those 2 guys. And then you can fill in the rest with everyone else that they have. I mean, and Travis Zajac at the third center position, or he's gone in a year after this. There's a lot that you can do. Pavel Zacha looks okay now. Looks like he maybe has learned his lesson after some interesting things last offseason. They have some okay pieces. So I think there is a chance in the Metro that this team, especially as Washington and Pittsburgh, they're going to start taking steps backwards. Like they might have a couple more years of a window for the Stanley Cup, but there's like teams up at the top. They're not going to be up at the top forever. So the Metro to me is maybe the most wide open in the Eastern Conference comparatively. So I'm looking at the Devils. They could make the playoff. They could become playoff contenders in 2 years. But as far as Stanley Cup contenders, I have them as my longest amount of time before a team becomes a Stanley Cup contender, mostly because I might as well just say I don't think the iteration of any of these core players is going to be good enough to win a Stanley Cup. But I put 9 to 10 years because I think you're going to have to flush through a lot of these guys. I look at Jack Hughes and Hischier and I see a team that, that's a nice team, but I don't think they're ever going to be a team that can go head to head with the superstars of this league. I mean, you look at like a St. Louis Blues. Okay. Not a team with a ton of superstars. Except for Colton Parayko is probably the most underrated defenseman in the NHL. Alex Pietrangelo is phenomenal. And then you've got Tarasenko, who is an absolute star. Just he happens to play in St. Louis, so people don't see him as often. And granted, he's hurt right now. Ryan O'Reilly is like this complete grinded out. Like he is a superstar. He just is totally different than all the rest. He's not your typical, like, I'm going to do this through pure skill. He's got phenomenal skill with
every tool.
Yes.
Every tool.
Yes. So to me, I don't see like Nico Hischier becoming a Ryan O'Reilly, a guy that can do those same types of things. I just don't think that this iteration of the Devils is in a position to become Stanley Cup contenders until they completely flush this lineup. So I actually had them at the bottom of my list. I had them at the very, very, very bottom because I'm like, you're going to have to rebuild again. They're rebuilding and they're going to have to rebuild again.
All right. Fair enough. So moving on from the Devils, next on my list, the LA Kings. I have them at 27. Pretty low for a team that, maybe a year ago you could have said they're a playoff team, they're a contender. And a couple of years ago,
they made the playoffs 2 years ago.
Yeah,
so did Anaheim.
I was talking. Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, but the game is changed now, right? So we're talking more speed, more scoring, and for a team to me that's got a lot of aging guys in their core that got long contracts, 2 or 3 years at least, that you really can't get rid of, that are going to be very difficult to move. You're kind of stuck in this hole, I guess you could say, that you can't really climb out of so quickly. Doughty's great. I think regardless, even at 30 years old, he's still going to be a top 10 defenseman in my opinion, and probably still will be for another 4 or 5 years.
You're not mad about having him or Kopitar.
Right. Yeah, and Kopitar still competes. He's still a good player. Jonathan Quick, he's on the decline. Luckily, they've got, Jack Campbell, they got Cal Peterson in the minors, guys who can potentially, ease some of that strain if, Quick doesn't really turn it around or doesn't ever get back to form. But again, with a lot of these pieces we've seen compete for Stanley Cups and win Cups in the past, they could, just out of nowhere, just be freaks, turn it on, and just all of a sudden compete, out of nowhere. But again, they've got a lot of older guys on long, 2-3 year plus deals that are going to make it very hard to compete, especially when you're tied down to these big numbers for so long.
Right. Yeah, I have the LA Kings also as rebuilders, obviously. I do think because of their high-end talent, where you've got Doughty and you've got Kopitar, that it really just maybe takes the right, all right, can you figure out some way to get rid of Dustin Brown? Can you do
maybe
anything?
A team like Anaheim, right? I mean, who's willing to take on a little bit of money? You say, okay, take this guy and we'll give you a second-round pick. Or we'll throw in.
They need that second round pick.
Well, I know they do.
I don't think the LA is really in a position to necessarily do that. Also, I think Dustin Brown has a pretty 7-team no trade list. So, but
one thing I will say for LA though is they do have a few guys that they can move at the deadline this year, like a Tyler Toffoli and Alec Martinez,
Trevor Lewis, Kyle Clifford. You can move those guys and
guys you can get some picks back for and maybe help accelerate a rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. I look at this team and I at least say, all right, you still have Kopitar, who is he's still putting up, like this season he'll probably end up with 70, 75 points. And so his regression over the next, say, 3 years, maybe he's like a 60-point guy in 3 years, but he's never been a speed guy.
We talked about Nashville, right, being a contender the last few years. Their number one center is only putting up 60, 65 points.
Right.
So you put good pieces around him, and then you don't have to worry.
And again, all this depends. Like if LA, which they are last place in the Western Conference, in the entire league right now, they sit a little higher because the Eastern Conference is bad, but they're 29th in the league. So let's say they do end up with the top 3 pick, and then they do that again next year. I mean, if you do that, you're going to end up with some great players, and that's going to accelerate your rebuild. And so, I think LA, based on having Kopitar, having Doughty, and having good goaltending, whether it's Quick or Campbell, both those guys are like, you can see one of those guys stepping up into that role and at least being good enough to become playoff contenders. Now, just because you're a playoff contender doesn't mean you're making the playoffs. It just means you're probably not finishing in the bottom 4 of your conference, bottom 3 of your conference. So I think LA may be close to becoming a playoff contender again. Stanley Cup contenders, though, I just don't know. Like, barring some miracles in the lottery, I just don't see this team being in a position to become Stanley Cup contenders for a little while, like 5 to 6 years before they have a chance to even move from being playoff contenders to going, wow, this team's shifting towards becoming Cup contenders again.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, they got a guy who I think can be a potential number one center with Alex Turcotte. They got basically a steal in the draft this past offseason that, 5-6 years will be right in his prime, ready to go. And so, yeah, you could potentially see him as the number one center, Kopitar number 2 guy, and they would have a really nice 1-2 punch at that point. So we'll see, but yeah.
They've got Martin Firk.
That old righty out of Detroit. Okay. 26, I'm moving on. Minnesota Wild for me.
Okay.
And, again, this is a team that, has competed the last few seasons, has always made the playoffs. Bruce Boudreau has always done a very good job of having them finish at the top of the division over the last few seasons. But it seems like lately they're hitting rock bottom. They're worst in the Central, and there's a reason for it. I mean, you look at their core group of guys: Parise, Mikko Koivu, Eric Stahl. These are all old guys, right? These are guys that are not getting any younger, not getting any faster. Then you look at the back end, Ryan Suter. He's stuck there for another 5-6 years. I don't even think
5 years. 5 years after this year, they have Parise and Suter.
Yeah, I mean
7.538461.
Ridiculous money, right? I mean, they've got a couple other nice pieces: Matt Dumba, Jared Spurgeon on defense, who are signed to long-term deals. But again, you keep hearing Matt Dumba's name thrown around on the trade block because if Bill Guerin's going to start a rebuild for this team, right, he's your best trade asset. He's a very capable top 4 defenseman signed at a relatively decent cap hit at $6 million. So teams that need a righty and need somebody who has the potential to be a 50-point guy, he could be that. And so you could get a big return on that. And then, again, this team has a lot of old guys stuck to long deals. So, Matt Zuccarello, those are guys that just aren't going to help you accelerate any rebuild. And I think when you got teams ahead of you in the Central and teams in the Pacific that I think are getting better, you're going nowhere but down.
Yeah, I actually don't have them as a rebuilder right now because I don't think you can say that you're trying to rebuild when
and I don't
7 months ago you signed Matt Zuccarello to a 5-year, $30 million deal.
Yeah, and I don't think they are a rebuild team yet to where they've said, but I think their window is very, very narrow. I think you have to get in and get extremely lucky in the playoffs. You got to get Dubnyk to play out of his mind, who is, he's getting up there in age. I think he's 33 and he's got one more year left on his deal. So, what are they going to do with him afterwards? So,
yeah, I would say that they are playoff contenders, but if we're looking at rebuilders, playoff contenders, they're that bubble. Like they're a team. In my notes, I say that they should rebuild, but they've continued to middle as they have for the last 10 years. Like they've been a playoff contender for the last 10 years. They've never been a Stanley Cup contender ever. Even when I think one year they came close to winning their division, and they still weren't a Stanley Cup contender. They just had a really good team. But they didn't have a team that over the course of 7 games could beat some of the upper echelon teams in the league, i.e. they could never beat Chicago. They always went up against those Chicago Stanley Cup winning teams. I just look at this and I go, there's no way you're going to be a rebuilder in the next year because of the way your lineup's structured. So at this point, you're going to be a team that probably finishes somewhere in the 26 to 20 spot. I think when you look at the standings right now, that's exactly where they are. I think they're about 25th in the league, and one win puts them into 21st. So they're gonna be somewhere in there by the end of the year. They won't compete for a playoff spot. They're too far back from the Edmonton Oilers. They're 7 points out of a playoff spot. So it's just, they're not going to compete for a playoff spot, but they're also not rebuilding. So it's that middle hell where your team isn't good, but you also know they aren't that bad. So you're not going to get anything good for it.
Right.
But Minnesota Wild could win the draft lottery. All you have to do is miss the playoffs and you can win the draft lottery. In the NBA, what were the Cleveland Cavaliers? They won the draft lottery that one year.
I know.
So you never know what can happen in that. The chances are very small, but even they might not win the first overall pick, but maybe you go from 12 down to 3. And suddenly you're in a nice position. Remember the New Jersey Devils went from, they won the lottery and I think they were 13th or 14th in the pick, but that was back when you could only move up a certain amount of spots, 5 spots or something like that. I think they moved from 11 to 6, and that's when they drafted Adam Larson.
Must be nice.
So I think Minnesota to me isn't quite that rebuilding team. I'd have them a little bit in the case of your list. In my mind, I'd have them a little bit higher because they aren't that even. They're not in a rebuild yet. So they actually have much longer to go because they haven't even started a rebuild. And of course, we have seen some teams be able to kind of not have to go through that treacherous Buffalo Sabres style rebuild where you have to be horrible for a while to even be halfway decent. You could retool kind of on the fly, and if Minnesota gets fortunate and Bill Guerin is able to work some magic here in his first general manager spot, and we'll see what happens. But let's go to your 25.
25, yeah. So at 25 for me, this is a team that they could be playoff contenders and probably might be playoff contenders, bubble on your list, but it's the San Jose Sharks.
So you have them basically as a rebuild.
Just about, because when I look at their window, I think their window is very, very tiny when you look at some of the other teams ahead of them, but a lot of their pieces that they've got signed long-term are very, very old. Obviously their defense is eating up a lot of cap money, and Brent Burns ain't young. Vlasic's not getting any younger. He's 32 at this point. 32. Your top forwards are in their prime. I mean, they're on their way out to retirement. Joe Thornton, Patrick Marleau, Logan Couture.
Well, I don't know if we're counting Patrick Marleau as a part of any kind of core with the San Jose Sharks.
These are the guys that they're relying on right now, right? Logan Couture's there; he's okay, but Evander Kane, he always seems to just go up and down. But these guys are locked into very long-term deals. So are these guys that I think can lead a team into playoff contention and potential Stanley Cup contention? No, I don't think so. And
really,
so
Erik Karlsson and Brent Burns just done?
I think Brent Burns will start. I think Brent Burns has hit his plateau and he's going to start to go down. While I still think he'll be a fine top four defenseman, I don't think he's going to be that point per game guy he always once was, right?
No, yeah, he's not that now.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah. I mean, but and more importantly to me, the bigger concern with this team, and there's nothing in the pipeline that gives me any optimism, is their goaltending. Right? They've got Martin Jones locked up for another 4 seasons after this. You're not going to dump him anywhere. Nobody's going to take him. So you either have to buy him out or hope the CBA gives you a buyout clause. Aaron Dell, he's been taking a majority of the starts now. He's looked okay, but at 30 years old, this is what you're getting at this point.
Right. At this point, you're going to have to make a deal. You're going to have to trade something.
Right. Or get extremely lucky and overpay for Robin Lehner in the offseason and pull him out of Chicago. True. And hope that he can turn it around for you.
Yeah, that's true. See, I wouldn't put San Jose in a place where they're not anywhere close to a rebuild. I mean, they're obviously trying to win the cup. Like, they thought they were cup contenders this year.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people thought they were cup contenders.
I thought they were a playoff contender for sure. But to me, I think now at this point, from what I'm seeing, they're closer at this point to me being a rebuilder than they are a Stanley Cup contender.
Yeah, we'll see who they bring in long term, coaching wise.
That'll be interesting.
Maybe that's a spot for Mike Babcock to go.
Interesting.
I know there's a lot of crap out there on Babcock, but maybe that's a spot. Hey, it'd be a nice spot to go and spend the last.
Well, I will say this: when you're on the West Coast, you don't get a lot of TV attention, so the spotlight's off him a little bit, and you can kind of hide out there if you're Babcock.
Yeah, you could. I mean, there's plenty of guys that. I mean, Gerard Gallant could go coach just basically trade McClellan and Gallant for coaching. That's the Sharks are in my list here. I have them as playoff contender. I say they're a middling team with tons of aging veterans. They could contend again though. Like if they get a lottery pick here, I mean, remember the last time that they finished out of the playoffs, they drafted Thomas Hertl at 6. And Thomas Hertl has become a nice top 6 forward for them and has been, like, I would say is, as steady as they come. For a guy at 6, you're not complaining about having a guy like Thomas Hertl. Granted, you can completely miss with the 6th, but you could also do better than Hertl at 6. Like Oliver Ekman-Larsson, I think, went at 6. So there's a lot of great talent that can be had, and one pick could change just the future for your franchise. But I would say it looks like they will probably spend 4 years chasing after the playoffs. They'll probably make the playoffs 2 or 3 of those years. I think this year, like, you look at how bad they've been. They're not this bad. They aren't this bad.
I hope so. I mean, for Erik Karlsson's sake too. I think a guy like that
next year they'll come back with a new coach and they'll come in and they'll make the playoffs and people will go, oh wow, yeah, last year I guess was an anomaly. I do think this year is a little bit is a blip on the radar. They do need to bring in some fresh blood though, and they'll have $18 million in cap space next year. They could trade Brendan Dillon, who could bring in something. You've got a Melker Karlsson, and I don't think you're going to have. You'll probably have Thornton come back. He just keeps coming back. Marlowe won't be back, and so you almost need those guys to just go. Like if I'm the Sharks, I'm actually saying we appreciate you, but we don't want either one of you back because we need to change the culture now. Like as long as Joe Thornton is there, it's his team.
Sure,
it's his team. You need to get him out of there. Like he can go sign somewhere else if he wants. He can go play with Ryan Getzlaff in Anaheim. It's not very far away. Or he can go play with Kopitar in LA.
There you go.
I don't see Thornton in a.
It's just weird to see him.
So I have them as, they're probably right in the middle of the pack of playoff contenders. They could become Stanley Cup contenders again if they get extremely lucky. Like if you add Lafreniere to this lineup, or Byfield, suddenly this is a whole different ballgame.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But that's an incredibly lucky turn of events if that were to happen. But otherwise, I have them 3 to 4 years left of playoff contention, and then probably someone's going to go, okay, we need to rebuild because now we have a 35-year-old Vlasic. We've got a 33-year-old Karlsson. We've got a 33-year-old Kocher. Like all your guys are going to be aged out.
Right.
You're going to need to move guys around. So hopefully for their sake, they have an ability to turn things around and have another few years of contention for the Cup. Do you have any other teams that you would consider to be like actually rebuilding right now? Who's your next? You know what? Actually, we're gonna stop for this episode, and you can listen to the next episode to find that out. I would say I have 2 other teams that are rebuilders. I'll tease them for you now. I've got the New York Rangers and the Chicago Blackhawks are my other 2 rebuilding teams.
Okay.
So if they're not next on your list, and I'm going to be shaking my head over here, but we will hear the rest of those and continue this list on the next episode of Overtime Hockey Talk. Let us know what you thought of our first 7 teams or so. And find us on Twitter @OT Hockey Talk. We'll talk to you guys soon.